Well, a very good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning. Good morning. Nice to see you here. I just wanted to come along and thank Keith for all his hard work and all of his presentations. I'm sure you'll agree they've been extremely enjoyable, yes? Good stuff. And he's here to give, thank you. And he's here to give his final talk for his section of the cruise. So please give him a very warm welcome. As you can see, he's going to be talking about then and now signals intelligence. So ladies and gentlemen, Keith Appleyard.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much, Leanne. It's really nice to have a gesture like that. And so here we are, swan song time, at least for this cruise. What I'd really like to do is use this session for tidying up a few odds and ends, and then trying to make a guess with you as to what on earth is going on with signals intelligence these days, and try and compare it in a way with what it was like when I was working in it. So there'll be a bit of covering of old ground, but hopefully we might be able to tie the whole lot together. So, odds and ends, tying a few loose ends together. Loose end number one stems back to the Shackleton talk, because I said towards the end of it that Shackleton had become number 11 in a list of the greatest Britons in a 2002 BBC poll. And then several people came up to me and said, well, if that's the case, who's number one? I can do better than that. Here's the top 10. Remember, it's not about leaders, which is what I was talking about. It's about Britons. And when I look at that list, it does strike me how fickle people's views are, how emotional they get about certain things. Because I suspect that if you did that poll today, which was, it was one of these phone-in polls, and you nominated your most famous Briton, I mean, who would you pick out? I doubt if Diana would be in today. What do you think? John Lennon still, greatest Briton? I don't know. Anyway, that was what I was asked, and that's the answer. So let's go on to today's little talk. Things have changed out of all recognition since 1970, as far as signals intelligence is concerned. Essentially, it's become far, far, far more complicated. So this is a bit of a talk about those changes and a bit of guesswork about how well the SIGINT community is doing to come to terms with them. So let's start going back a bit to an old friend. You remember that? The Enigma machine. Because that machine, that little chunky typewriter sort of thing, I think is pretty much responsible for determining how signals intelligence evolved during and after the Second World War, and right up, I suppose, till today. When I gave the talk on Bletchley Park, I don't think I was terribly clear about how that thing worked. So let's clear that little thing up now. The thing you need to recall about the Enigma machine is it is purely a machine for encrypting and decrypting messages. It's actually nothing to do with sending them. And if we show this picture, you can see how a couple of people are working at it. Probably needed two people to operate it. What you have here, sorry, go back one. Here, this chap, he's got a message in plain text. And what he's doing is keying it in. And as he presses the keys, the lights light up there, and his colleague over here is seeing the light come on, and he's writing down what letter is lit up. You start with plain text, you end up with encoded text. And the determination of which letter lights up, as you remember, is those 3 rotors. So he'd then go away and send a message, almost certainly by Morse, and that's the thing that would be intercepted at what were called Y stations, the UK intercept sites. And they'd all end up at Bletchley Park, where the encoded messages would be put in the machine. Sorry, I'm doing very well here. Very slow. There we go. Right? The bomb. And the purpose of that machine was solely to try and find out what the settings of those rotors were. And having got the settings, they could then put the encoded message in their own little Enigma machine on a table just round the corner, and you've then got a pile of German coming out, hopefully. So, once you got to that stage, it could then be translated. It could be sent out to whoever needed to know. And that's the basic process of signals intelligence. Intercept first, process and analyze, and report and disseminate. And that's still true today. The only difference is the bits of kit and the sort of messages which are being dealt with. And just to summarize this little introduction, in order to, after the war, in order to continue that work against whatever new target came up, we had that organization. A 5-nation agreement to share intelligence. And as I said earlier on, this is an expensive game. It costs far more than the rest of the intelligence budget combined, MI6 and MI5, and in America, much more than the CIA, plus the FBI. So, why does it have so much value? Why are we spending so much money on it? I'd like just to repeat a segment of video I showed you earlier, which to me explains why signals intelligence is seen as so valuable. See if I can get the video to work.
While the accuracy and depth of intelligence gathered by conventional human spies can be severely limited, communications intelligence can provide the full inside story.
Basically, the best source of intelligence that you have is signals intelligence. It's far better than spies. With a spy, you never know whether he's not sending information to set you up someday for some kind of a deception. With signals intelligence, you're getting the absolute information from the horse's mouth. You're sticking your head into the other guy's huddle. You're hearing his exact words, what he's saying, what he's thinking.
So that's why signals intelligence is so valuable. Was valuable in the Second World War, valuable today. So, how should we structure the talk? I'd like to start off by talking a bit about targets. Who are we trying to eavesdrop on now? And then communications. How do these targets communicate amongst themselves? And how do we, as a SIGINT organization, intercept those communications today? And finally, how do we process them? Let's start with targets. The old target was very simple. It tended to be the communist world led by the Soviet Union. It was a clear threat in 1945 and onwards. A different ideology. Enough weapons to destroy the UK, Europe, and pretty much all of the Western world. And to respond to that threat, GCHQ trained hundreds, probably thousands, of Russian linguists. And the division at Cheltenham, J Division, which had the Soviet Union as its target, was actually by far the biggest division that was there. And they listened to Russia for half a century and did a pretty good job of it. However, they thought it would last forever, and it didn't. And the key date, I think, where signals intelligence had very rapidly to change was then, the fall of the Berlin Wall in December 1989. The Soviet Union was officially dissolved a couple of years later, and it's still of interest. It's still a target, but it doesn't have that overbearing threat of annihilation which made it the overwhelming primary target from 1945 way up to about 1990. So you've got a different world. You've got a world without that great big red blotch on it. You've got the Western world, the one superpower and its allies. And I suppose we could have been forgiven for thinking in the early 1990s that that was it. The big threat had gone, and yeah, we're going to have problems, but they're going to be little local difficulties. It didn't last. New threats arose pretty damn quickly. You good on flags? First threat, which appeared in the 1990s, was the former Yugoslav Republic, Bosnia, Serbia, and Croatia. And you remember the awful war that proceeded from that conflict. Afterwards, we get another set of flags, represented by George Bush's phrase, the war on terror. The axis of evil, Iraq, Iran, and North Korea. And at the bottom, we still hear in newspapers every day, the problem of Afghanistan. All these people are targets. All these nations are targets. And having targets like that created new problems. I think the biggest problem it created is connected with language. Just look at some of those countries. Afghanistan. The population there, about 50% speak Persian, 35% around that speak Pashto, about 10% speak Turkmen. And you get the same fragmentation in Iran. All those languages are commonly spoken. And in Iraq, predominantly Arabic, but with significant amount of Kurdish and Turkmen as well. Just think of the problem, right? I learnt Indonesian. It took about a year. And prior to that, it took something like 6 months to go through the screening process known as positive vetting. Now, these problems come up pretty damn quickly. How do you suddenly find enough people to work in this sort of secure environment who speak those languages, which almost immediately we have a great need for? It's not an easy problem to solve. So you understand, I think, what I mean by saying things are actually getting a bit more complicated these days. Even gets worse. The war on terror. You might not recognize this flag, but you'll certainly recognize this person. We're talking about Al-Qaeda. Because at least on the previous slides, these were targets that were nation states, our nation states. We know where they are. They don't actually move about. They don't hide. With Al-Qaeda, it's not a nation. Where are they? Where are they moving to? And of course, since Al-Qaeda became influential, we've had a series of events which have changed the world in many ways. Primarily, of course, that one. But it wasn't the first. There was an attack on the World Trade Center in 1993. Did some damage, but few casualties. There was an attack on the American embassies in Nairobi in 2008. In 1998, of which over 300 people were killed. There was an attack on the USS Cole in the Yemen in 2000, 17 dead. And as we know, many more dead in that event. And so it goes on. Bali, 12th of October 2002, 202 people killed. Madrid, 11th of March 2004, 191 people killed. London, 7th of July 2005, 56 people killed. And plus, of course, many more injured. And here, a complex story gets even more complicated. Think of it from a signals intelligence point of view. What you're trying to do is intercept the communications of the people doing that so that you can prevent it. Now, you see the problem here. Because the people who generated that awful event lived in the UK. We aren't listening to someone 2,000 miles away. Well, this is homegrown terrorism. How do you intercept their communications? Well, you can do it, but in doing so, you've got to listen to everybody's, yours and mine. It's a difficult problem. So we have a very different world as far as targets are concerned. How do these targets that we've mentioned communicate with each other? And how does that compare with what I was doing? Well, in my day, the then communications, again, it was fairly simple. We were talking about high-frequency radio and messages passed either by voice or by Morse. The signs of these things were things like this: transmitting aerial, a tall pole with a load of wires hanging from it, all shapes and sizes really, a receiving aerial which would look like that. So the shapes and sizes don't matter too much, they're after different sorts of signal, but the principle was actually the same, because high frequency Morse actually didn't shoot off into the atmosphere. Oh, I'm sorry, I'll come back to that in a second. Landline and submarine cables was the second of the communications methods that was used at that time. But coming back to the HF radio thing, that map shows what happens when HF radio Morse is transmitted. You basically got a transmitter over here, and instead of shooting off into space, the signal bounces about. It's quite easy, actually, to get a signal from Vladivostok at Digby when I was there, because it keeps bouncing. And so you've got a whole technology based on that principle. You know, there's different layers in the ionosphere, there's different situations at night and at day, but that's the main principle of the thing. Now it's different. We're not sending HF Morse that much anymore. Sending a bit, but not too much. We've got different methods. And I'd like just to talk about three. First of all, microwave radio. Secondly, satellites. And thirdly, fiber optic cables, which have, but to a large extent, replaced the old HF radio. Let's have a look at microwave radio, first of all. You can tell these things, because although they're different shapes and sizes, the principle again is the same. You'll recognize them around the countryside. That one's a small one, a pole with those dishes hanging off it. That's a bigger one. Many more different dishes. These things are parabolic dish antennae placed on towers in high positions and on hilltops. And the point about these is the signal doesn't bounce off the ionosphere, it goes straight up and out into space, where in fact if you've got a satellite waiting, it could pick it up. But that's not the point here. The point here is because the signal goes in a straight line, you need these things set up at probably, 40, 50-mile intervals, right? So then they go from one to the other. So that is microwave towers, satellites. Satellites came into business somewhere around the 1960s, communication satellites. And the thing about these things is that all of them will take all forms of communication simultaneously: telephone, telex, telegraph, television, data, fax. There's a picture of an early one. These things, known as communication satellites, ComSats, were operated by an organization called the International Telecoms Satellite Organization, made short to Intelsat. That's one of the early ones. This is one which is going to be launched this year. And the principle of how these work is shown on this diagram. There's your satellite. Yeah? The signal is transmitted from somewhere on the ground. Up it goes. And then it is sent down to a whole range of receivers. 1, 2 there, 1, 2 there. So up to the satellite, down, back to Earth, somewhere else. There are about 23 of Intelsat satellites, I think, active today. And finally, should mention fiber optic cable. Previously, the cables were essentially copper wire, but the introduction of this thing transformed it. It works by sending pulses of light through an optical fiber. And by 2002, an intercontinental network of over 250,000 kilometers of submarine cables had been laid to take this. And it's significant because this takes most of the email traffic. You can actually do a map of how this travels around the world. That's a map which shows how the email messages travel around. And what you'll notice is that an awful lot of it comes into and goes out of the United States and also in Europe. And conveniently, when it passes through these areas, it passes through switching stations. And it doesn't take too much imagination to realize that duplicates can be picked up from those switching stations, can be intercepted from there. Which takes me on to intercept. What happened when I was working? Again, very straightforward. Showed this slide before. You had intercept sites which had antennae, essentially that one, the Hong Kong one there, where you see the poles with wires dangling off them. Sometimes it got a bit more complicated, the Chicksands one, but it's still poles and wires. And once the thing had been received, it then went into the buildings nearby and was listened to on receivers like that and copied down by people like that. Intercept operators working 24/7, probably in 8-hour shifts, taking down stuff they didn't understand, but nevertheless had a great pride because it was they realized its importance. So that was then. What about now? Well, with the introduction of satellites and microwave towers, the Morse and voice thing became, to a large extent, obsolescent. You had to find new ways of getting into all this satellite communication. both for intercepting and processing. And there are actually 4 ways of doing it. One's called shadow stations, or I've called it shadow stations. There are SIGINT satellites, there are aircraft, and there's a thing called echelon, which I'll explain in a few moments' time. The SIGINT shadow stations were SIGINT's first attempt to get into all this satellite communication. And basically, what they wanted to do was build a SIGINT station, that one's viewed, near to an Interset downlink, one of the Intelsat downlink stations. And that was 60 miles from Goonhilly Down, which took all the traffic collected by the Intelsat satellite, which was in geostationary orbit over the Earth. Geostationary orbit means when you're there, if you looked at and saw it, it would appear to be standing still. And what happened, of course, was when the message came down to Goonhilly Down, there was some spillage. And that spillage was all picked up by GCHQ viewed. So that's one way of getting and intercepting satellite communications. Not the best way, actually. The better way still is to put your own satellites up. Started in about 1969 with a Rhyolite satellite, launched with a missile from Cape Canaveral, would you believe? And when they started launching these things, they realized it struck a gold mine, did NSA. What they wanted was to really get hold of information about Soviet missile launches. What they found was, in addition to that, they got massive amount of VHF and UHF phone messages. They found themselves listening to Moscow chauffeurs talking about their Politburo masters. A gold mine. And these things have been developed more and more ever since. That's Orion, launched around 1986. It has this massive sort of parabolic antenna. Looks like, where are we? Here. Which is used, there are 2 of them normally, giant umbrellas that unfurled once the thing was in orbit, and one collected the signals, the others passed them down to Earth. Now, on a global scale, you don't need too many of these things, as I'll try and illustrate with this slide. This was actually taken in 2010, this diagram, and what it shows is 5 satellites, SIGINT satellites, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Not quite in geostationary orbit, they're moving around a little bit, but the big circles, all this sort of stuff, shows the coverage. And that is what we mean by global coverage. The United States can in effect intercept communications almost anywhere on Earth if it so chooses with these 4 or 5 satellites. So, shadow stations, satellites. What next? Aircraft. We mentioned aircraft before, and they're still around. Aircraft like that, RAF Nimrod. I talked about them in their role as ferrets, going up to the Baltic and trying to find out what the Soviet air defenses were doing. Still a few left, but just about to go out of service, and they're going to be replaced by 3 American aircraft doing the same thing, but a bit better, RC-135s. And you can don't actually need a pilot for some aircraft in use today. The Predator, the pilotless drone, being used in a SIGINT role to great effect in Afghanistan and Pakistan to intercept telephone calls. And now we come to this word at the bottom, excuse me, echelon. Echelon is a code word which has got a massive amount of secrecy surrounding it. And it refers to the link between the SIGINT satellites and the ground stations that receive the information and the data from those satellites. So what we've got, and it's kept very secret, is a worldwide network of receiving sites interconnected by secure satellite communications links. And these are the information, it ends up in GCHQ and NSA and the other SIGINT headquarters. These sites in the Echelon network look like that. Menwith Hill in Harrogate, or near Harrogate, one of the biggest of the Echelon network in the world. Pine Gap in Australia. And what you see is big fields with what look like giant golf balls in them. If you took those off the actual covering, you'd see that there are massive parabolic dishes, and you put the golf balls on for a couple of reasons. One is to protect from the weather. The other is you can't see which way the thing is pointing, and some people may well be interested in that. So there's a worldwide network. I couldn't actually find the best map for this, but I picked one up from a German website which gives a rough idea. So the system you've got is these SIGINT satellites, as it were, along that line, eavesdropping on communications wherever the target is at the moment, and then downloading them to these various sites here. In the States, Sugar Grove, another one there, one in Canada, Australia, Shoal Bay, one in New Zealand, Japan, there's a Harrogate site up there. There are lots of them. Not public knowledge what this particular list actually is. Now, I've got a couple of short video clips which I'd like to show you. The first one, remember I mentioned Duncan Campbell. He was the bloke who blew the whistle in the 1970s on what GCHQ and all the intercept sites actually did. But he's worked since then with the European Parliament, and this is a sort of clandestine type video where he's trying to explain what Echelon actually is. It's taken in about 1989, I think. Now, I've got a slight problem here. Just see if I can get the thing to go.
Echelon is a code name given by the United States and other countries in the Listening Alliance to some of the stations which intercept communications from commercial satellites. They run a totally integrated worldwide surveillance system in which stations in one country will collect information and automatically forward it to American intelligence, whoever wants it. For many years, the electronic communications network that they ran was bigger than the internet itself. And even today, it is very, very large, collecting millions of messages every hour, analyzing them and passing.
There's another video clip, which was from a discovery program I picked up, which explains much the same thing, but with a few nice pictures.
Echelon, the most secret spy system. It's called Echelon. It's so super secret that no one inside the government will acknowledge it even exists. Insiders will tell you off the record that Echelon is a synonym for an intelligence-sharing partnership, including Great Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the U.S., which is led by the U.S.'s National Security Agency, or the NSA. Together, they eavesdrop on every corner of the world, on phone calls, faxes, and emails, even on ATM transfers. In 2003, on the eve of the war in Iraq, Secretary of State Colin Powell opened a small window into the world of Echelon when he went before the UN to reveal some of its secrets. Intercepted conversations like this one between two top Iraqi officers.
Remove. The expression, I got it. Nerve agents. Wherever it comes up, got it, wherever it comes up. Because the senior officer is concerned that somebody might be listening. Well, somebody was.
Powell was attempting to demonstrate that the Iraqi government was hiding chemical weapons. But at the same time, it was an unprecedented public admission that the United States was listening in on the Iraqi military. It's likely that the intercepts Powell quoted originally came to the U.S. through Echelon. In this case, from a British listening post, particularly well situated to pick up intercepts from the Middle East.
Echelon.
So, that is Echelon as far as we know. And which, quite frankly, in my view, we don't know very far. Do you realize you're living in a world like this? So, we've had a look at the targets, which are more complicated, the communications, which are more complicated, and intercept, which has changed out of all proportion. Let's finish off by having a look at processing, because we have a big problem here with this new system of collecting information from satellites and sending it to GCHQ and NSA. And the problem is, here we go again. Then it was very simple. When I was working, all you had to do was locate the target, where it is this Russian Air Force squadron based. You listen to it, either voice or Morse, and then you transcribed, descript, translate, whatever you could do with it. Fairly straightforward. But under the new system that we have today, you've just got too much traffic. You can't actually identify the target and just listen to that in isolation. You've got to take everything like a giant Hoover and then sort it out afterwards. And the figures that come out from this system are mind-boggling. In 2002, 1 year, you can see how cell phones increased. 2002, what's it like now? Internet users in 1 year, 90 times. Telephone traffic increased from 38 to 100 billion. And who's saying this? This man, Michael Hayden, who was the director of NSA in 2002. So it is a massive problem. How can you cope with figures like that if you're intercepting that amount of traffic? The answer lies in this thing, supercomputers. That's a Cray supercomputer. Takes 64 billion inputs per second. At NSA, they've got 9 acres of those things. Can you imagine, can you get your mind around that sort of size operation? How's it work? Rather like Google works, a search engine. It just searches for particular things. They're called, if you like, dictionary computers. So out of all the masses and masses and massive of information that come into NSA, they first go through these filters, through these computers who filter out significant words and phrases. If you send lots of emails with the word terrorist and bomb in them, you probably find yours is filtered out. Significant dialing codes, significant telephone numbers, significant individuals, and significant topics. So that's just a very broad outline of how it's done. You understand the principle. So what you have in those things is essentially a top-secret search engine. And what sort of volume of traffic does it cope with? There's another quote. One intelligence collection system alone can generate 1 million inputs per half hour. Filters throw away all but 6,500 inputs, and only 1,000 inputs meet the forwarding criteria. So 10 inputs are normally selected by analysts, and only 1 report is produced from 1 million inputs in half an hour. And the man who said that was this man, Admiral Bill Studeman, also an NSA director. So there we are. Where are we today? I don't actually know. What I've told you today are really guesses for targets, communications, intercept, and processing. And it creates problems for us. What about tomorrow? Well, a few statements of the obvious from me. First of all, however big it is today, it's going to be bigger tomorrow. More mobile phones, more email, more social networking. If we can't cope with it now, we certainly can't cope with it next year. Second statement of the obvious. Only one nation has the capacity to collect microwave, mobile phone, email traffic anywhere on the planet. You know, remember I showed you that slide of the coverage of the 5 or 6 satellites which are going around at the moment. But it still can't cope with it 100% on its own. It needs help to identify and analyze useful intelligence. So where does that leave us? Well, we're dependent on the states if we want to stay in this game. Those of you who came to a previous talk may remember we talked about an equal sort of agreement signed in 1948 called the UQSA Agreement. I don't think it's actually equal anymore. We've got a role, but we can't go it alone. So there's a part of the price to pay. There is a price to pay for intelligence if we want to stay in this business. First one is money. During the talks, I've told you occasionally how much we're spending on it. And it's going to get bigger unless we pick up our bags and go away. But remember, we're a target ourselves. It might be useful to know what's going on in a terrorist's mind somewhere in the world. Which is, of course, the problem of privacy. If there are 3 or 4 people in Manchester at the moment planning to blow up Manchester Airport and are communicating about it, the price we have to pay is that everyone in Manchester is going to have all their phones, all their email traffic intercepted so we can sort out our potential terrorists. So there we are, end of homily. I hope you enjoyed the talk and hope you actually enjoyed the series. I'd like to finish with what are basically 2 thank yous and a dedication. First thank you is to people on the ship, Leanne and her staff, Gary and Tom up there in the box. You don't actually realize, I think, just how much of a luxury this is for me. I worked plenty of times in colleges where you're lucky to be able to get in the room, and if you get in, the equipment, if it's there, doesn't work, and the technician's off duty. And here, to have it all laid on for you is great, really marvelous. The dedication is to all those people, the thousands of them, some of whom I worked with, who spent a significant part of their working life with earphones clamped on their heads, listening through all sorts of snap, crackle, and pop and static to stuff they didn't really understand, but they copied down day after day with enormous conscientiousness. I've got a massive admiration for the intercept operators in the SIGINT world. So this series of talks is for them. And finally, of course, biggest thank you, the second one, is for you, the audience. You've made my cruise, people. You really have. I found that you're turning up. You've shown an enormous amount of perseverance, me with a croaky throat, mics that occasionally go wrong, temperature in the room, which sometimes appears to me to be near freezing point. And you're still here. So, I say au revoir because I never say goodbye. We always meet again in some way. And this is very true for me. If you want to talk to me and don't have time now, for anything, tell me stories, ask me questions, or just for a chat, please, please keep in touch. There's an email address, and I'd be really, really happy if you contact me sometime and have felt that this has been a worthwhile series of talks and we can continue in some way further on down the line. That's it, ladies and gentlemen. You've been a great audience. Have a fantastic cruise for the rest of the time while I get on an aeroplane tomorrow and go back to, I think, something like 6 degrees and rain. Thank you once again